Bodie, California. This place once had more saloons than churches, and just about every miner and outlaw you could imagine. By the late 1800s, 10,000 people lived here, chasing gold. Then the boom fizzled, and the cold Sierra winters helped drive everyone away. What's left is a snapshot of the Old West, frozen in time with buildings standing just as they were left. Alamo Crossing, Arizona. Back in the day, families built homes and ranched cattle out in the desert. Then came the dam project in the 1960s. The government wanted a reservoir, and the whole town wound up underwater. You can still take a boat out on Alamo Lake and know there's a little piece of history sitting quietly below the surface. Cairo, Illinois. Sitting where the Ohio and Mississippi rivers meet, this town should have stayed prosperous forever. Riverboats docked, industries thrived, and the streets buzzed. But in the 20th century, racial tensions boiled over, businesses shuttered, and people left in droves. Today, empty buildings line streets that once saw parades, and you can almost hear the echoes of what might have been. Thurmond, West Virginia. For a while, every coal train seemed to roll through here. The banks, hotels, and even a movie theater kept the place lively. Then the coal business shifted, and the trains stopped stopping. The crowds left too. These days, only a handful of folks remain, and the National Park Service looks after what's left of the once bustling Main Street. Centralia, Pennsylvania. It looks like a regular coal town from the outside, but deep below the ground, a mine fire started burning in 1962. Folks thought they'd put it out quick, but that fire is still smoldering today. Streets buckled, houses emptied, and most everyone had to pack up and leave. The smoke still rises in places like a ghost that never left. Kennecott, Alaska. High in the Wrangell Mountains, a mining company built a whole empire out of copper ore. Workers lived in tidy company housing, and trains carried out riches by the ton. When the ore ran dry in 1938, folks just walked away. The giant red mill buildings still cling to the mountainside, like ghosts watching over the valley below. Rhyolite, Nevada. Few boomtowns rose as quickly or fell as hard. Investors built fine hotels, banks with marble lobbies, and even an opera house. Then the gold vanished, and so did the people. By 1916, it was empty. Today, its crumbling stone walls and a still-standing bottle house tell of big dreams that went bust almost overnight. Jerome, Arizona. It was once called the wickedest town in the West, full of miners, saloons, and a reputation for trouble. When copper prices fell, so did the population, 15,000 down to just a few hundred. But the story didn't end there. In later years, artists and free spirits drifted in, turning the place into a quirky mountaintop community with a haunted past. Ironton, Colorado. Tucked high in the San Juan Mountains, prospectors once dug silver out of the hills and built a busy little town. At its peak, there were 1,000 people, a hotel, and even a school. Then silver prices collapsed, and the winters proved too harsh. One by one, families left. What remains now are weathered cabins staring out at empty slopes. Oatman, Arizona. Once a rip-roaring mining camp, it boasted gambling halls and miners spilling into the streets. When the gold dried up, so did the crowds. What stuck around were the burros, descendants of pack animals left behind. These days, they wander Main Street like they own the place, giving visitors a living reminder of a boomtown that refused to disappear completely. Batstow Village, New Jersey. Tucked in the Pine Barrens, this place was known for its ironworks back in the 1700s. Later, they made glass and even charcoal. But by the late 1800s, industries shifted elsewhere and the town emptied. The buildings never truly crumbled, though. Today, walking its lanes feels like stepping into a history book, quiet, preserved, and a little eerie in the stillness. Cisco, Utah. A lonely railroad stop in the desert, it grew into a service town with oil rigs and rowdy bars. Travelers on Route 6 kept the gas stations alive, but when the wells dried and the interstate passed it by, the lights went out. Now, graffiti and wind-scoured walls are all that mark the spot where fortunes once flared briefly. Ruby, Arizona. This camp had a reputation rough enough to scare most folks. Shootouts, rustlers, and lawmen made the headlines. For a time, the silver and lead kept money flowing, but by the 1940s, the mines closed and the last families packed up. The schoolhouse still stands, a reminder of a town that lived fast, fought hard, and faded away. St. Elmo, Colorado. With hotels, stores, and even a telegraph office, it was once one of Colorado's busiest mining towns. But when the railroad shut down and fire tore through, folks left quickly. What remains today looks like a movie set. False front buildings lined up against the mountains, holding their shape even as the wildflowers creep in around the edges. Elizabethtown, New Mexico. Gold drew thousands to the Sangre de Cristo Mountains after 1866, and for a while it thrived as New Mexico's first incorporated town. Then the mines gave out, and fire did the rest. By the early 20th century, the place was nearly empty. Now it's little more than weathered ruins, with the wind whistling through where saloons once rang loud. Ludlow, Colorado. Coal miners and their families once filled this camp, but labor tensions turned deadly in 1914 during a violent strike. The tragedy scarred the town, and it never truly recovered. Over time, homes and businesses were abandoned. Today, a small memorial stands in place of what was once a bustling community, tied together by coal and hard work. Cement, California. Built around a cement plant at the turn of the century, this was a company town through and through. Workers lived in neat rows of houses, the plant looming above them. When the plant closed in 1927, there was no reason to stay. The houses were hauled off, and the ruins still peek out from the hills like broken teeth. Berlin, Nevada. Born in the gold rush of the 1890s, it had all the usual trappings: stores, a post office, and saloons for thirsty miners. But the ore didn't last. When the boom went bust, folks drifted off. Today, the skeleton of the old mill still stands, and the desert air has kept the wooden shacks in surprisingly good condition. Dozier, Texas. It was never a big town, maybe 100 folks at its peak, but it was home. School bells rang, church doors opened, and neighbors knew each other by name. Over the decades, families moved away for better work, leaving only scattered homes and an old school building. The prairie winds now sweep through what's left of its short-lived story. Cahaba, Alabama. This quiet bend in the Alabama River once held the state's first capital. Politicians and planters built fine houses, but the river had other plans. Floods came again and again, chasing people away. By the late 1800s, it was little more than ruins and overgrown streets. Today, it's a haunting historic park, with moss and silence taking over. Valsetz, Oregon. This was a true company town, owned and operated by a lumber outfit. Families lived in tidy houses, and the mill kept everyone busy. But when the timber ran out, the company shut it all down in 1984 and bulldozed the whole town. Today, not a house stands, just empty ground where generations once built their lives. Bannock, Montana. Back in 1862, gold was discovered here, and before long it became the first territorial capital. Saloons, shops, and cabins lined the streets. When the rush moved on, Bannock shrank to almost nothing. Today, it's carefully preserved as a state park, with wooden sidewalks and creaky buildings that look ready for a gunslinger to step through any moment. North Brother Island, New York. Sitting in the East River, this little island once held a quarantine hospital and later a rehab center. By the 1960s, it was abandoned altogether. Now it's off limits, overgrown with trees and vines, with crumbling brick buildings peeking out like relics. Even in the shadow of Manhattan, it feels worlds away, silent and reclaimed by nature. Goldfield, Nevada. For a time, it was the largest city in the state, bursting with miners, gamblers, and fortune seekers. The gold strike of 1902 made it rich, but the veins thinned out, and fire and flood took their toll. While a few hundred people still lived there, the grand hotels and crumbling streets tell the story of a boom that never lasted. Garnet, Montana. Up in the Rockies, miners struck gold and built a lively little town with hotels, stores, and saloons. When the veins ran out, people left, only to return years later until fire swept through. Twice abandoned, Garnet now stands as one of the best-preserved ghost towns in the region, its wooden cabins echoing with the silence of two lost generations. Dogtown, Massachusetts. On the rocky ground of Cape Ann, colonists carved out farms and homes in the 1600s. But after the Revolution, families moved inland to richer soil, leaving the stone foundations behind. Over the years, stories grew, witches, wolves, and wanderers haunting the place. Today, mossy cellars and carved stones are all that remain of a village swallowed by legend. Pacher, Oklahoma. This mining town once pulled more lead and zinc from the earth than anywhere in America. But prosperity came with poison. Waste piles towered like dunes, the water turned toxic, and sinkholes opened under homes. By 2009, the government declared it too dangerous, and folks were forced out. What's left now is an eerie wasteland where industry outlived the town. Castle Dome, Arizona. For nearly a century, silver and lead pulled prospectors to this desert camp. The saloons and smelters kept things lively, but when the ore gave out, there was nothing left to do but leave. The dry climate preserved dozens of old buildings, and today it's an open-air museum where you can almost hear the hammering from the old blacksmith shop. French Gulch, California. This was one of the state's oldest gold towns, settled during the rush of 1849. For more than a century, miners scratched the hills and a community carried on. But in recent years, wildfires roared through the valley, destroying what little still stood. What once survived the gold rush finally fell to flames, leaving only memories and charred ruins behind. Glen Rio, Texas/New Mexico. Sitting on the state line, Glen Rio thrived on Route 66 travelers. Gas stations filled tanks, diners served up pie, and motels promised a night's rest. Then Interstate 40 came through, cutting the heart right out of town. Businesses closed, neon signs went dark, and the desert crept back in. Today, faded buildings stand silent, a postcard from the highway's golden age. Superior, Arizona. Copper gave this mountain town life, and for decades the magma mine fueled the economy. When the mine shut down in the 1980s, the jobs disappeared almost overnight. The town never truly recovered. A few shops and houses hang on, but the boarded windows and quiet streets tell the story of a community that once thrived on the promise of ore. Bayhorse, Idaho. High in the Salmon River Mountains, prospectors carved tunnels into the rock and built a bustling little camp. When the silver ran out, folks drifted off. The old stone kilns used to process ore still stand like sentinels over the ghostly remains. Today, it's a state historic site, preserved enough to let visitors imagine life in a rugged mining frontier. Blue Heron, Kentucky. This coal camp was carved into the hills by a mining company in the 1930s. Families lived in simple houses, and the company store kept them supplied. By the 1960s, the mine closed and the community emptied. These days, it's an open-air museum with replicas and exhibits where visitors can walk through the shells of a vanished way of life. Henry River Mill Village, North Carolina. This textile village grew around a mill in the early 1900s, with rows of simple houses for workers. When the mill closed in the 1970s, families left, and the homes slowly decayed. Decades later, the place found new fame as a filming location for the Hunger Games. Even Hollywood couldn't bring it back. Today, it's still a ghost of industry past. Rodney, Mississippi. Back in the 1800s, this river town nearly became Mississippi's capital. Steamboats docked, commerce boomed, and churches rose. But when the Mississippi River shifted its course, Rodney was left stranded. Floods later battered what remained. Today, the old churches still stand, sometimes with water lapping at their steps, reminders of how a mighty river can make or unmake a town. Cuervo, New Mexico. Once a lively stop on Route 66, Cuervo had gas stations, motels, and a tight-knit community. Then, Interstate 40 split the town in two, cutting off its lifeline. Businesses closed, families moved, and stone buildings began to crumble. A few folks still hang on, but most of Cuervo now stands abandoned, a ghost clinging stubbornly to the New Mexico wind. Thurber, Texas. At its peak, this was the largest coal town in the state, owned lock, stock, and barrel by a single company. Thousands of immigrant workers called it home. But when oil replaced coal in the 1920s, the company pulled out, and the town emptied almost overnight. Today, all that's left are ruins, a smokestack, and stories of a once busy camp. Ashcroft, Colorado. Near Aspen, this silver boomtown sprang up in the 1880s with saloons, hotels, and even a newspaper. Investors hoped it would rival its neighbor, but the ore played out quickly. Within a few years, the place was nearly empty. Today, its weathered false front buildings still line a dirt street, preserved as a ghostly reminder of promises that didn't pan out. Grafton, Utah. Founded by Mormon settlers along the Virgin River, families farmed and built homes here in the 1860s. But floods, disease, and conflicts with nearby tribes made life harsh. By the early 1900s, most folks had moved on. The abandoned schoolhouse and homes now sit quietly under red rock cliffs, one of the most photographed ghost towns in the American West. Central City, Colorado. Known as the richest square mile on Earth, this gold camp grew into a bustling city of theaters, churches, and rowdy saloons. But when the gold ran out, so did the crowds. For years, it was nearly deserted. In the 1990s, legalized gambling brought a partial revival, but its grand old buildings still whisper of booms and busts long past. Dawson, New Mexico. This coal town once held thousands, complete with schools, a hospital, and even a bowling alley. But tragedy struck twice. Mine explosions in 1913 and 1923 killed hundreds. The town carried on for a while, but when the mine finally closed, residents scattered. Today, nothing remains but a cemetery with rows of white crosses marking the memory of a lost community. Seneca, Oregon. A small lumber town in eastern Oregon, it thrived as long as the sawmill roared. When the mill closed late in the 20th century, Jobs disappeared, and families left. Today, only a few hundred people remain, still incorporated, but a shadow of its former self. The wide streets and empty lots show just how quickly industry can vanish from a place. Eagle Mountain, California. Built in the 1940s as a company town for iron mining, it once housed thousands with schools, stores, and theaters. When the mine shut down in 1981, the population collapsed. For a time, the site became a prison. Then that too closed. Now the desert has reclaimed most of it, leaving behind rusting gates and silence where life once bustled. Orla, Texas. For years, this little spot in the desert was practically a ghost town, with only a couple of hardy residents. Then the oil boom returned, and suddenly trucks and workers packed the place by day, though few stay at night. It's an odd one, neither alive nor dead, where empty buildings stand alongside busy rigs, a reminder of how fortunes swing fast. Chloride, Arizona. Back in its heyday, 5,000 people lived here, drawn by silver mines in the Turbat Mountains. Stores, saloons, and even a newspaper kept things lively. But when the ore played out, so did the crowds. Today, only a few dozen residents remain, keeping the old spirit alive. Murals and weathered buildings remind visitors that this desert town once roared. Helena, Texas. Once known as the toughest town on earth, it had a reputation for rowdy brawls and rough justice. But when the railroad chose a different route in the late 1800s, the town withered almost overnight. Businesses folded, families left, and its title of toughest was lost to history. What remains now is little more than a ghost with a story. Valverde, New Mexico. This river town played a role in the Civil War, sitting on a battlefield along the Rio Grande. But the river that gave it life also took it away. Floods swept through again and again until the settlement was finally abandoned. Today, little remains but stories of soldiers, settlers, and the unstoppable power of the river that erased it. South Pass City, Wyoming. Gold brought prospectors to this wind-swept spot in 1867, and for a few short years, saloons and stores lined the streets. When the veins ran dry, people moved on just as quickly. Today, it's a state historic site, with restored buildings showing what frontier life looked like. The wind whistles through, carrying echoes of those who once gambled everything here. Chinese Camp, California. In the gold rush era, thousands of Chinese immigrants built a bustling settlement here. Shops, homes, and temples lined the streets, and it stood as one of the most important Chinese communities in America. But over time, prejudice, economic shifts, and decline hollowed it out. Recently, wildfires have ravaged what little remained, leaving just a fragile shell of history. Wayroom, Pennsylvania. Built by a coal company in the early 1900s, it had houses, a school, and even a YMCA for the miners. But when the seams played out, the company closed shop. By 1934, it was deserted. Today, if you wander the woods, you might still spot an old foundation or a sidewalk slowly being swallowed back into the earth.